Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. What an incredible conference. What an incredible way to return to conferences, which had been a really big part of my life for a long time until the pandemic started. We're still in it, but it's exciting that we could sort of come back and be in space together again. And what an amazing conference to have resumed that practice with. I'm actually, a lot of the ideas in this talk have already been discussed by a lot of the previous speakers, so I hope it's still useful and interesting and relevant. But I'm very comforted that I don't feel kind of isolated and alone in my concerns for the future of computing. So I think I could just give a round of applause for the organizers and for Fission for putting together an incredible conference. My name is Ramsey Nasser. I'm a worker owner at the Emma Technology Cooperative in New York City, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. And this talk is not a demo of a particular technology or anything like that. It's a response to the general theme of this conference, which is the future of computing. And the title is a reference to this image. Does anyone recognize this image? Oh, one person. So I'm obsessed with this thing. I have it on a t-shirt, which is lame, but I was wearing it yesterday, if anyone noticed, underneath my sweater. This is the Alexamenos graffito. It was found in 1857, scratched into a plaster wall in Rome, Italy, in a building that had been a boarding school in the Roman Empire. It's a little difficult to date, but the best estimates place it at having been made around 200 AD. It depicts a person gesturing in front of a figure on a cross with a donkey for a head. You can kind of see, it's crude, but you can maybe make that out. The text, which has a spelling mistake, says in Greek, Alexamenos worships his god. It may be meant as a mocking depiction of Jesus Christ on the cross. If it is, that actually makes it a contender for the earliest pictorial representation we have of the crucifixion. And it's a shitpost, which blows my mind. And like I said, I'm completely obsessed with it. Not because I think it's funny or a good joke. Actually, it's super hurtful and punching down, because when it was made, Christianity would have been a minority religion in the Roman Empire. So this is just some shitty boarding school kid mocking a classmate for having a different religion, which is not cool. But I'm obsessed by the fact that it is completely recognizable as a hurtful joke across millennia. It wouldn't be out of place on a problematic meme page today. You could sort of see, it's a lazy Photoshop of a donkey head on Jesus. You could see, just imagine that text was in white impact and towards the bottom. This is just totally a meme, right? We can totally parse it, even though we live in a society that the person who made this couldn't comprehend, right? 1,800 years has passed, and it A, survived, and B, remains recognizable to us. So a better title for this talk may have been, how to tell a joke that remains parsable as such by future civilizations, but that's a mouthful, so I just went with tell a joke that'll be funny in 2,000 years. I'm obsessed with it, again, because it sort of survived this sort of expanse of time, and it's understandable, and I also want to make work that survives in the vastness of time and remains understandable. And I also love making jokes. So I do a lot of things, and I wear many hats, I guess. My practice is all over the place, but to me, it all kind of comes from the same place. It all feels sort of coherent. I'm an artist, a computer scientist, a musician, a game designer, a tool maker. Did everyone see that cool little trick? So I love making tools. This whole talk is actually running in my new arbitrarily powerful slideshow framework. It actually runs code on slide advances, so if I wanted to, I could put a whole 3D engine in my slideshow, which would be a goofy thing to do. I wouldn't actually do it. I think of my practice as kind of a nesting doll, if you will. It has a central goal with layers that I've added as I've grown as an artist and as a practitioner to support the layers beneath. So currently, my main concern is making my practice sustainable surviving under capitalism while remaining an independent researcher and artist. So I've been thinking a lot about how I organize my labor, and I'll be talking about that a little bit. That sustainable practice is meant to support the research that I'm passionate about into programming language design, compiler design, and virtual machine engineering. The languages and the virtual machines and the compilers are meant to help me build frameworks, tools, and engines that I use to make jokes. Is sort of all I really want to do. At the heart of it, it's a way to connect with people that I really, really love. And I can give you a few examples of what I mean. So a couple of years ago, there was a moment where making Twitter bots was like all the rage, and I made a bunch. The one that I'm maybe the most proud of is called 555 microhertz, and it was a bot that was tweeting every frame of the film Top Gun, one frame at a time every 30 minutes. It was anonymous. I didn't have my name on it. I just sort of put it out there, and 8,000 people started following it, and it just injected a bit of like chaos into everyone's life. Like, why would anyone do this? It created a sort of slow communal movie viewing experience. You could see the sort of like comments, but it is now in ruins because of a very real takedown notice that I got from very fancy lawyers on the part of Paramount Pictures, saying that a user on your website, Twitter, was distributing the Top Gun film frame by frame. The following URLs are some examples of the user's Twitter's account, with additional frames being uploaded continuously. And I think a takedown notice is the sort of like comedy, it's the sort of like cherry on top of the comedy sundae. I think intellectual property sort of turns everyone a little bit insane, and I find it kind of hilarious to play with. The good news is I learned my lesson. So recently I made a piece called F1, F2, F3, F4, F5, F6, F7, F8, F9, which is a concatenation of all 9 Fast and the Furious movies into a single unwatchable, panic-inducing 2-hour cinematic spasm. It just, after they made the 7th one, I was convinced that I had to make this, and I thought that by making it, I would understand why I felt that I had to make it, and that didn't work. I still don't fully know what I'm trying to say with this, beyond the fact that like we did this as a society. My favorite thing that you get out of it is you could see Vin Diesel, who's the beefiest man, across 2 decades of beef. So there he is in the corner in the first Fast and the Furious, and he does a lot of contemplative looks, which I really, really appreciate. This is out in the world. People are grabbing the torrent. This was on TikTok, which is not a social media network that I'm on. But people are watching it and engaging with it, which just fills me with so much joy that there's a little bit of completely like nonsensical chaos just out there in the world for people to consume and sit with. So I also make video games. I love making video games. And in 2017, a fascist organizer was punched on camera during Donald Trump's inauguration. And there was a debate in America about whether it's okay to be violent against people who are trying to exterminate people like me as an Arab Muslim. So to meditate on that subject, I made a mod of id Software's 1992 Wolfenstein 3D, which is the original Nazi shooting video game. And it asks you ethical questions before you can defend yourself against Nazis, while the Nazis, shoot you to death. So the game is unplayable, sort of, as a result. And this is also like, I had a political statement I wanted to make, but also like, I think it's pretty fucking funny, right? Just to put people in this situation. So what I'm trying to say is I love computer jokes, right? This is a sort of very long-winded way of saying I love telling jokes on computers, and I'm using joke as not like dismissively or in a self-deprecating way. I'm using it almost in a reverent way. A joke is a kind of an art that I like to make a lot of, and I do other things. I'm not just a clown boy. I'm mostly just a clown boy, but I'm not just that. This is a digital art piece that I don't consider a joke, that I consider quite serious. It is a bilingual name. It's عكس المحتل ليس الشاغر. The opposite of occupied is not vacant, and the URL is occupied.land. And this is just a collection of Google Street View locations around occupied Palestine, where it's impossible not to see the violence that it takes to uphold Israeli apartheid. And it's just sort of presented, you just sort of dropped in these locations to wander around and sort of draw whatever conclusions you want. So really, I love making computer art, right? And I think I focus on jokes because I think there's something really profound in the frivolity of a joke, in making something that doesn't need to be made, and like needs are going to come up in this talk in a little bit. But art in general and jokes in particular on computers are things I take very, very seriously because this is the platform that I feel most expressive in. So when I think about the future of computing, that's what I think of is my own work and its longevity. The graffito, the Alexamenos graffito lasted and was still recognizable 1,800 years later. And how much of what I made will be accessible, let alone understandable in 20 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? Like how much of the code that we're writing is going to be, do we honestly believe is going to be runnable in a millennium? I would like my work to survive, and I kind of have to ask myself why. And I think some of it is the usual sort of mortality stuff, right? I think death is something that I think about a lot. Particularly the sort of second death, right? You sort of have this first physical death and a second death, which is the last time anyone ever mentions you. So that weighs on me, which I don't think is an unusual thought for a mortal human to have. But also, the work of others that came before me, whether it's art or theory or technology, those that have passed before me have been so formative in my life, in my practice, that is something I would, insofar as I'm capable of, I would like to pay that forward to future generations. And if I'm being honest, I'm worried that I picked an ephemeral medium to work in. And I'm worried that I'm drawing in sand or writing in rain, which is a line from a Lebanese song. So to make concrete my concerns, with no moving parts, you'd think that working software would work forever. Everyone in this room knows that that's not the case. And software breaks, through no fault of its own in a way that's kind of incredible. So I did a lot of Twitter bot work, like I said, the microhertz, and I did other ones that I didn't share. There was a moment, like I said, there was a big community of artists. Darius Kazemi and Alison Parrish were doing amazing work. That's just not really possible anymore, The Twitter, Musk chaos aside, the API being locked down. I think there's a free tier now. After this was posted, I think they backtracked. Maybe that'll disappear. Who the fuck knows, right? You sort of existing at the whims of a corporation to make your art on. It's not a way to build work that has any chance of being sustainable. And this is common in the tech industry, right? There's this sort of bait and switch pattern where platforms will have this like free tier to get as many users as possible, and then you come in, you build a practice on it, you build a sort of existence on it, and all of a sudden the free tier disappears. And that's fucking dishonest, right? I mean, it's effective, it's optimal by some definition of the word, but it just wrecks a bunch of your work. So I had a lot of stuff running on Heroku that just basically went down when the free tier was taken away. So, arguably, this is, someone mentioned, I think Jen mentioned the naive moment in 2006 when we were all excited about APIs and these hosted services. And, arguably, that could be chalked up to that. And we should have known better at the time than to trust centralized corporate platforms and hosting all of our work there. And it was kind of dumb in hindsight for us to fall for that. But we've all learned, and we're never going to do that again. And we're never going to build art practices on centralized shit. It'll probably be fine this time, though, right? Yeah, it's fine, right? So I did my obligatory LLM mention, so I won't be, taken out after this talk. But it's also not limited to hosted services, right? Who here learned to program on Flash? Anyone want to date yourselves? Yeah, a couple of people. So this is how I learned to make video games, on pirate copies of Macromedia and then Adobe Flash. But then because of corporate maneuvers, Flash was kind of left in this bizarre state. It's deprecated, but not open source, which happens to a lot of these proprietary systems, right? So, if you made a bunch of work in Flash, like I did, these are my backup CDs, my backup DVDs from 2004. There isn't a way to run this really outside of, I guess, a Windows VM and an old Flash player binary. I had just had code sitting on disks. Like nothing about the code changed, but the art broke still. Not that the games I was making in 2004 have any sort of profundity to sort of pass on to future generations. But this is what I mean by I'm really worried that I'm in an ephemeral medium and I'm making art that just by its very nature is doomed to evaporate in my own lifetime, let alone across millennia. And at the risk of sounding like a curmudgeon, I feel like computers are also less interesting today than they were when I was coming up. I really believe that programming a computer is the most agency in the relationship, the most agency you could have in your relationship with it. And it shouldn't be a requirement. And I think a lot of, the pendulum swings a little too far in that way. I don't think everyone should be a programmer. But that door, I think, should always be open. Like anyone who wants to be a programmer, I think should be welcomed in with open arms. And computers are just harder to program today. Like it's just harder to run arbitrary code on a general purpose computer today, which is bonkers to me. This is the pop-up you get on Mac OS. I haven't been on Mac in years, but this is the pop-up you get when you try and do something as exotic as run a program on your computer that hasn't been signed by the Apple Corporation. This is a far cry from being dropped into a basic prompt by default, which is what computers in the 80s and 90s used to do. They were just programming was the default way you engaged with those systems. In 2011, Cory Doctorow gave a talk called "The Coming War on General Purpose Computing," and I feel like that war is in full swing, and that general purpose computing is losing. Smartphones are even worse. Getting code to run on an iPhone is its own its own puzzle. And my heart honestly breaks for kids who are coming up, and this is their experience of computing as consumers and not as agents. But it's okay. I use the web almost exclusively as a result. The web is incredible. It has incredible reach. They take backwards compatibility very seriously. Stuff you did in the 90s will actually still run. It's simple. It lets me put 3D engines in my slideshows. That's what this is. This is just a locally hosted website. It's gotten good enough that you can use like modern JavaScript features without a build step, and that's basically all I do. My favorite hot take is that the browser is an acceptable small talk, which told to the right people will make their faces turn all kinds of colors. It's like we did it. It's not what we thought it would be, but we have a multimedia programmable platform, and it's fine. But there's also what I feel is a complexity fetish creeping into the web as well. Joe Armstrong, the late Joe Armstrong, sort of touched on this in a talk that he gave about a decade ago called "The Mess That We're In." And he sort of saw that programming is becoming this sort of tools upon tools and these layers upon layers. And you see this in the web. All of these ostensibly solve a problem, but a lot of the problems that they solve really only make sense at like a corporate scale. And every one of these tools is brittle, and all of their sort of interaction points are brittle, and they break, and they need to be maintained. My favorite Dijkstra quote is that simplicity is a prerequisite to reliability. And I think the future needs reliability. I think we need to be building reliable systems for the future. And we're not building simple systems, so I don't think we're building reliable systems. The number of young programmers that I've talked to who are convinced by boot camps and coding academies and YouTube channels that they need React to make a web page, I think is criminal. I swear to God, you're not making Instagram. Like you just use HTML, and you don't need this like gigantic framework that you have to wrap your head around. So modern computing feels like it's building on unstable grounds to me. It's increasingly locked down. It's increasingly complex. All these things make me worried about the future and like my art surviving and new people making art that also survives. But there's also another threat to the future of computing that I'd be irresponsible not to bring up. We have to sort of step outside the usual, I think, critique of computing to start to perceive it, though. So this is the TCP IP stack. But the metaphor I'm about to make would work with any sort of layered architectural stack. the sort of meaning of these stacks is that every layer really only needs to know about the layer beneath it, right? And this is what makes architecture like this powerful. Like you could swap out higher layers without changing lower layers. You could swap out layers in the middle and be minimally disruptive to the rest of the system. We have no problem looking up, building abstractions upwards as engineers, right? So you have HTTP is an application layer protocol. ActivityPub is its own protocol that's defined in terms of HTTP. Mastodon exposes its own API, which is also defined in terms of ActivityPub. And you could write a bot that uses the Mastodon API, and you can build up as high as you want, right? What we'd never do, though, is look downwards. Every version of this diagram that I've ever seen magically stops at the network interface, or in the OSI model, the physical layer, right? It stops at the physical world. One way that I've been reading these diagrams is they're almost like dependency graphs, right? Every layer actually is not meaningful without all the layers beneath it. So, without TCP and IP, HTTP is just a thought experiment. It's just, you could sort of make up whatever protocols you want, but there's no way to like manifest them in the real world. So what's actually below all the stacks, right? It's this. Everything we do depends on an electronics industry. That electronics industry depends on resources that are collected and secured by the metal and petroleum industries and other industries, other extractive industries. Those industries need access to resources that are geographically distributed all over the world, right? If you're an American company and you're trying to get quartz, and that quartz is in Brazil, you need a way to secure a resource that is in a country that you're not in. That happens through trade agreements and war. And all of that, none of this is meaningful without a habitable planet. For this kind of perspective on the material reality of computing, Ingrid Burrington is a researcher you should all look up, who does brilliant work on this stuff. But this is what I think a more complete TCP/IP stack looks like. If we claim to care about the future of computing, we have to start thinking about it, to use a phrase from the previous talk, holistically with a W, right? The whole system, right? We can't sort of frame these lower layers as not our problem, because they very much are. The top 3 gray layers are a direct existential threat to the bottommost layer. And if we can't solve this, then none of the layers above, they're forfeit, right? All of that stops being meaningful. This kind of brittleness, too, is not just theoretical, right? We're experiencing a chip shortage, which is a result of the pandemic and among other factors. And we're still in it. We're arguably coming out of it. It's kind of mixed, but this is a whole, the stack is not stable and is not really resilient to the challenges that are coming down the pike. Another thing I'll say too on the same subject is that computer hardware doesn't have a life cycle. It has a life path, a lifeline. I don't even really know what to call it. But materials are extracted, processed, turned into products. They're consumed, and then when they're done, they go into a landfill. And we're missing a sort of, there's no fourth edge here. And given finite resources on a planet, there's only so many times we can turn this crank, just materially, right? And this isn't to like shame people for using personal like computers and stuff. Data centers in the military are actually major consumers in this context. But this shape feels like a threat to me. So all of that is a long way of saying I don't think computing as we know it today is set up to carry us into the future. I think it has to radically change in order to survive. I'm not a pessimist, though. I do have hope. There are things I think we can do and I want to talk about. But before we do, I want to sit for a moment with like what's going on. This is something that I feel is missing in a lot of talks about the future of computing or problems with present computing. This conference not included. I'm again blown away by the sort of perspectives that have been shared here. But the sort of question of like, why, right? Why is this happening? Why is software increasingly brittle when we know how to make it better? Why is software increasingly locked down when we know that open systems are just more resilient and more inclusive and just better engineering? Why is no effort being invested at scale to make computer hardware sustainable, despite it being an existential threat to organized human society? Why does progress seem so hard to hang on to when we achieve it? And why do we experience so much backsliding? What forces govern computing and decide its future? To an extent, it's us. It's people like us in this room, practitioners, researchers, theoreticians. But the hard parts are not technical. And I think a more complete answer to this question requires us to get even further outside of computing itself. And we need to start talking about how society allocates resources. So I'm sorry, but this is the part in the talk where we have to talk about capitalism. I think it's absurd to talk about anything, let alone building the future, without factoring in resource allocation. I'm not an economist. I'm not a political scientist. I'm an engineer. And I approach these things from an engineering perspective. And this is something we know from engineering. Like, there's no shortage of literature on garbage collection and memory management. We think about resource allocation in engineering all the time. And the version of that in society is the economy. Which is why we have to talk about the economic system that we live under that sort of decides what gets made and what doesn't get made. There's a lot to say about capitalism's shortcomings. It has moral shortcomings. It's inherently unstable. There's about 200 years of literature on it that'll do it, better justice than I could ever hope to. But I want to focus on the effect that this economic model has on limiting our actions, our imagination, and our sense of what's possible. So, quick definition, just for completeness. Capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Simplistic, but broadly correct. To break that down, private ownership of the means of production, that basically means unelected people control the productive assets of society, right? I won't dive into this too deeply, but the takeaway here is that capitalism is, despite a lot, propaganda that if you grew up in North America or received an American education like I did, capitalism is not a democratic system and does not aspire to be one, right? It is a system that puts a group of people, it assigns them the authority to basically direct the resources of society as they see fit. But yeah, we won't dive too deeply into that. I want to focus on the second one. Because even those people that are sort of given the authority to direct our future, to direct our resources, which in turn directs our future, they don't have a free hand. Capitalism really only has one verb. It has only one mechanism, which is profit, which is the transformation of money into more money in a system where money is being used. And profit is not, people getting paid. Profit is not compensation. Profit is what's left over after all expenses have been covered, right? And that goes to the first group of people to decide to do with what they will. Maybe they reinvest it. Maybe they buy yachts. Maybe they put it in a shoebox. It's up to them at the end of the day. But it's this operation for profit that I really want to sit with, because I think there's more to it than maybe meets the eye. But before moving on, I want to point out something that's missing from this statement. And that's any mention of human needs or wants, right? There's actually no theory of capitalism that claims that it directs resources to meet human needs. You could read all the literature you want. No one makes that claim. Capitalism directs resources towards profitable activity. And then it is an act of faith that profitable activity overlaps with human needs sufficiently, right? So you still have the one mechanism. All you can do is chase profit, and we hope that things that are profitable are also good for a society. If you work at a corporation, you may think that it's your job to write documentation or to write software, but it's actually not. We all have one job, which is to make whatever organization we're in profitable, right? And everything else is a side effect or exhaust. So I'm worried that the pursuit of profit, distinct from human needs, is a distraction and a constraint on our collective action and imagination. So like I said, I'm not an economist. I'm a computer scientist, so I can kind of better explain my concern maybe with some set theory. So who's up for some Venn diagrams? So let's say this white space is the set of all possible human activity, right? So this space is me coming to Toronto to give a talk. This is someone in South Africa eating a shoe. This is anything a human being can do. I'm going to call a subset of all human activity useful. Useful broadly here means it meets a human need or a want. It's art, it's care, it's making food, it's maintenance, it's all the things that human beings legitimately need or might want. I'm going to call this other subset profitable. So this is all human activity that will generate a profit under capitalism as it exists today. So for approaching this as computer scientists, our question is, what is their set theoretic relationship? We only have a few options, and we can dismiss them by contradiction. So the first possibility is that they are equal. Maybe anything useful that a human being, any useful human activity is profitable, right? That's an assertion that can be made. I think I can dismiss this by pointing out, like my first few slides, where I made a bunch of things that made me happy, made everyone here chuckle, and a little bit of like chaos and levity is an art I think meets a human need. I have not and will never make profit off of internet jokes. So the existence of something that is useful and not profitable dismisses this particular configuration. Are they totally disjoint? Maybe nothing profitable is useful. This is like, really heavy-handed leftist like propaganda might say this. I also don't think this is true, right? I think, feeding people is useful, and there are some restaurants that run profitably. So again, by contradiction, I would sort of dismiss this configuration. Is profitability a subset of useful behavior? Is anything profitable somehow useful? I also don't think this is the case. There's a lot of profitable activity that is not useful. My favorite example is email spam. Who here likes receiving email spam? So who do you think? Nice, one person.
It's like reading the takedowns when they respond to them.
They are very good. So no one likes receiving them. Who do you think enjoys sending email spam? Like, do you think people grow up dreaming of being an email spammer? Like, they come from a long line of email spammers, and there's like the family lineage, and there's like a sports anime about email spammers. That doesn't exist. No one wants to do that. Like, no one wants to receive it. No one wants to do it. But it happens, right? Because through some mechanism, someone is making money off of it, enough to justify its continued existence. Through that contradictory example, I'm happy to dismiss this case as well. So we have this boring conclusion, which you could have maybe guessed I was getting at from the beginning, that they have some overlap. So the question is, and the degree of that overlap is, it's subject to your worldview, and this is not to scale, and this is not formal at all. But the tricky question then is, given a useful activity, where does it fall? And it's hard to say, right? It's a high stakes question too, and it's really hard to say. But my key point is that there is actually no guarantee that given that there's something that we need as a society, that there is a way to make it fit in that intersection. And if we can't make it fit in that intersection, then this economic model and everything related to it, corporations, startups, VCs, all the mechanisms that late capitalism has at its disposal cannot deliver needs or human activity, or cannot direct resources towards human activity that is outside of that intersection. And we're basically forced to solve this unrelated puzzle, right? If there's a thing we need to do, we need to find a way to make it, we sort of take this detour to find a way to make it profitable before we're allowed to do it at scale. Otherwise, we have to leave capitalism and do it outside of capitalism and find a way to survive while doing that. I worry that what we need for the future of computing might be in that moon-shaped piece. And that gives me that's a source of a lot of concern for me. Maybe I'm wrong, right? But general purpose computing is harder to make profitable than locked down appliances that spy on you. The profit model there is much more straightforward, and I feel like that's why we've trended in that direction. Sustainable, long-lived hardware, a laptop so robust that I could pass it down to like the next generation, that's harder to make profitable compared to a laptop I need to replace every 2 years. Again, the profit model there is just much more straightforward. Making everything open by default, open source everything, open protocols everything, that's harder to monetize than locking everything down and charging subscription fees. Averting climate collapse, is there a way to make it profitable? Because if there isn't, this is not the economic model that'll do it, right? I think this model constrains our actions and our imaginations at a time when we need every bit of action and imagination. And I think the profit motive is an intolerable constraint to place on the present that I think is strangling the future. So none of this is a critique of the people who are like working in companies or even starting companies. I feel like when I have these conversations, people ask me like, wait, am I a bad person? It's like, it's not about you or like individual people. It's about a system that has limits that we need to be honest about. And I bring it up only because I feel dishonest talking about the future of the future of anything, particularly computing, without addressing the reality that the thing that governs it, the system that decides what gets made and how it gets made is outside of a lot of the mechanisms that we are very passionate about. So what then? Like I said, I'm optimistic. None of what I just said was optimistic, but that part comes next. So when thinking about the future, I think about it in two parts. There's goals and there's a sense of trajectory. So there's a sense of like where I think we should head, and I want to sort of stress that obviously this is all my own views and ways that I think we could sort of head in that direction today. There's a great saying from the Hadith, actually, in Arabic about people who talk about the future, which is "Kazibul manajjimun walau sadaqu," which means fortune tellers lie even when they tell the truth. So by talking about the future, you're sort of wrong by definition. So I'm just going to go into it with that caveat that these are my own speculations and my own perspectives. So I think the future of computing needs to meet needs and not profits. I want the rest of the fucking circle, right? I want every weird idea that people have to be given space and oxygen to be explored, because we can't actually know what the future needs. And maximizing human potential is, I think, the only play we have to start building out the tools we will need to last, 50, 1,000, 2,000 years. I think the future needs computing that is stable, not ever shifting. Building on corporate platforms absolutely cannot do this for us. This is, does anyone recognize these? I need to start like a group of people of just like archaic, obscure scratchings that have survived millennia. This is homework by a child named Onfim, who what's on the left is a spelling assignment, and what's on the right is a self-portrait of him as a wild beast. Onfim was a young child, probably about 7 or 8, who was living in Novgorod in 1260. So this is sort of part of present-day Russia. And these were scratched onto birch bark. That's how he did his homework. If we can't aspire to centuries-long time spans for this stuff, then we're not talking about the future of computing. We're just talking about, keeping the present alive. So this is the standard I think we need to hold ourselves to. This image has come up already in this conference. I think the future needs computing that is open and not walled off to people, that's with doors that's open and closed at the whims of oligarchs. And I'm convinced that the option to inspect and program the devices in your life is the bare minimum requirement to consider them anything more than intrusive presences in your life. If the end user cannot inspect and reprogram the thing that's in their life, then I just think that it's a dead end. This is both around systems that are explicitly, this concern relates to systems that are locked down explicitly, and also systems that are locked down implicitly through complexity, right? You can lock a thing without a lock, right? By just sort of, flashbanging the user with dizzying complexity. And I think we need human scale programming and human scale computing as a result. There's a lot of conversation that's been around local first computing, and I think it relates to that. I think the future of computing needs to be sustainable and not a cancer on the planet. Like I said, in my lifeline of the manufacturing process of computers, it was missing that edge. Like when we're done with a computer, how does it come back into the cycle, right? The way we make things last on a planet with finite resources is we build cycles and not lines. Nature does this sort of by default, and if we don't start emulating it, the threat is existential. This one is actually not subjective. I actually think if we don't do this, the future is basically canceled. And then finally, I think the future needs computing that is democratic at every level and not totalitarian. In the Ecology of Freedom and in other writings and talks, Murray Bookchin argues that we can't actually be in harmony with nature until we stop trying to dominate it. And we can't stop trying to dominate nature until we stop trying to dominate each other. So from the perspective of computing, every participant in the project of computing, including those involved in the extraction, manufacture, programming, use, and maintenance, they need a democratic say in that process insofar as it affects them. If we can't break down these hierarchies, then computing will continue to be built on exploitation and oppression, which is, it's not only immoral, and I never want to moralize, because you can't convince people to care about other people, but it's also unstable. And I feel like that's something people of any sort of political persuasion or worldview can agree on, is that stability is preferable to instability. When people are exploited and oppressed, something that you do see consistently throughout history and across cultures is that people resist oppression. And as long as there's a boot on someone's neck, whether it's in the extraction process, whether it is in the manufacturing process or anywhere in the process, there's going to be resistance. And there's going to be an enormous amount of resources diverted to meeting that resistance. And I feel like that is a diversion of resources that we cannot afford going into the future. And the only way to avoid it is to break down hierarchies and give people agency and build a democratic future of computing. So that's a lot of stuff. And I don't want to conflate things that are difficult with things that are not worth doing, right? I think if things are bad ideas, then they're bad ideas. But I think if something just sounds really hard, that's not enough to dismiss it as a goal. But given those goals that I believe in, the next question is how do we go about achieving them? Anarchist theory has this incredibly powerful idea that has various names, but it gets talked about as prefigurative politics. And the basic idea is that your actions in the present must manifest your goals for the future immediately. This is mostly used in the critique of a vanguard leftism, where we're going to have an authoritarian movement that is going to deliver us towards an egalitarian society. Right? Anarchists say that this is a dead end and can't work. Another way to think about it is that in terms of a unity of means and ends. Your end and your means to that end have to be unified. And it's very hard to do, right? Because you're trying to exist in the current world while manifesting the world you're trying to build. But But this is a tactic. This is a deployable, a usable tactic. And it makes me want to say that the task I want to put to us then is to start thinking about prefigurative computing, which is, I feel like, what people have been talking about a lot at this conference. Manifesting the kind of computing we want to see in the future. And when I say future, I mean 2,000 years in the future. Manifesting that today to the best of our abilities. So I want to finish by looking at some projects that I think are doing this. In addition to all the amazing work that was shared at this conference. Mastodon is not perfect. It's far from perfect. But Mastodon allows small communities of people to self-organize, self-moderate, federate with each other, defederate with toxic communities, and it's small. And it has a smallness that feels like the future to me. This is where I am on the two instances that I use. The bottom one is 90% shitposts. The top one is 20% shitposts. So pick your poison. Oxen is a virtual machine developed by a group of artists called 100 Rabbits. It is a virtual machine that is optimized for implementability, which is a vector of optimization I'd never even considered in VM design. But they're trying to build a virtual machine where they could make their art such that it will survive. And it's just easy enough to implement that no matter what happens, no matter what the future looks like, someone can pick up their art and the spec and make an Oxen virtual machine and see their art. This is a kind of resilience that really feels like the future to me. Some of you may know my earlier work, my present work, thinking about programming, non-Latin programming. I did a project called Elb, which is an Arabic programming language 10 years ago that I continue to work on. In my 2019 Deconstruct talk, I actually sketch out where I actually want that work to go, which is a programming language that doesn't privilege any written culture, which I don't have time to get into here today, but you should look that talk up. It's pretty short and I think digestible. This also, to me, feels like the future, like computing that is just in English is a future of computing that doesn't include me, that doesn't include the people that I grew up with, and it's not a future that that really meets I think the standard that I want to set. The Solar Protocol is a web platform hosted across a number of solar-powered servers. So this is a single service that is delivered by multiple servers distributed around the world, and depending on how much sunlight they're receiving, that's the server that'll field the requests. Again, low power, distributed, anti-fragile. This also feels like the future to me. Finally, I mentioned moving towards a democratic model of computing, and there are ways that you can start doing that now. Worker cooperatives are a way to organize labor in a way that every participant, all of the employees, which I put in quotes, become owners of the company and have a democratic say in the way that it's managed and the way that it's run. I feel very strongly that people starting new, who feel entrepreneurial, who want to start new projects, I feel very strongly that you should consider starting a cooperative instead of a corporation, which is not a democratic model. If you work at a corporation, I also strongly encourage you to consider converting into a co-op. There are ways to do that. If neither of those are viable, I think you should hire co-ops to really support that movement, because I think it's a very valid one. You may not know any co-ops. You may not know who to hire. Hi, my name is Ramsey Nasser. I am a worker owner at the Emma Technology Cooperative in New York City. And this 40-minute anti-capitalist tirade was just a sales pitch. So thank you. Round of applause. Emma is I have the pleasure of working at Emma with some of the most talented developers I've ever known. We are taking on new clients. So if there's any kind of work in the VR, AR, web, compiler space, our skills are very, very wide, please get in touch with me, and I'd love to see how we can help you. And I'll end on this quote by David Graeber, which was already mentioned in Chia's talk, in the second talk in this conference, that if you take anything away from what I said, that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make, and we could just as easily make differently. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the lovely talk. And I also want to say, very cool sticker on that laptop there.
Oh, thank you.
So, as an anarchist myself, I try to analyze a lot of these things through a lens of power and how power guides profit and that kind of thing. And for the last century, there has been quite a bit of power directing profit and profit directing power in tech. Like we had the space race, which was a very like capitalism versus communism. And we had a lot of other ways of power curtailing technology development. Do you think there are paths like where do you think we can find, like, was there a point in the past that you know of, that you think of, that like, hey, this was like some really cool stuff that we should like go there, like, you know, the fission versus fusion choice? Is that something you're aware? Is that something you can speak to?
Do you mean
it's more history than?
Yeah. Do you mean like a forking point in technology?
Yeah. Like, you know, dang, wish the internet hadn't been made by like the military.
Right.
You know,
right.
that kind of stuff.
I mean, there are a couple of things. Yeah, there are. It's funny the way, and that is, I guess, a question about history. And it's funny how a lot of history is often shaped by the way a few events will go one way or the other. I know that the Levant was Arabized when Arabic was sweeping through the Middle East. It was originally a colony of Byzantium, right? There was one battle that decided that decision, right? Like I speak Arabic because of something that basically took place over 6 hours one day, 1400 years ago. So, in terms of anarchist history, the anarchist Catalonia being crushed by the fascists. If that hadn't happened, who knows what that would look like. Anarchist Ukraine as well being crushed by the Bolsheviks. So I feel like certain societies and projects surviving, I think, could have like altered the course of history potentially. When it comes to technology, I don't. I do sometimes think about like what would technology have looked like if it had been developed in the Middle East and not, in the West. But you kind of, I feel like there's something humbling to computing there, where we're such a small player in that story. In order for that to happen, the entire geopolitical layout of the planet would have to be different, right? So you have to sort of work backwards from that and figure out why the Arabs kind of never really had agency in the last 150 years to do something like that. So I don't have a great answer for it, but yeah, it's an interesting, I think, framework to think through.
Thank you again for the talk. So I'm really interested in co-ops, especially technology co-ops.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice or insight into how to solve co-ops where workers of unequal skill come together? The remuneration problem, the salary problem, when it's high-tech coders plus grocery bagger or something, like the jobs which in the wider capitalist world are remunerated dramatically differently.
Yeah.
How does that apply to co-ops, and how can that be made to work with co-ops?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was younger, I was kind of convinced that everyone should be paid the same, which is simplistic. And it's actually more important that everyone be allowed to make decisions equally. So the short answer is the remuneration strategy should be whatever everyone involved consents to. That answer generalizes, right? More concretely, so at Emma, we all get paid the same way, but we all don't get paid the same. We all get the same base salary, and we do client work, and we get a commission on like client invoices that we clear as individuals. So if a member wants to do more work and bring in more money, they're empowered to do that. If a member wants to basically, wind down their workload so they can have some time off, they're also empowered to do that. And we all have a base salary. And the key thing is we all consented to that. I know bigger organizations like Mondragon is the sort of go-to example of a gigantic 80,000 person co-op. They're not all remunerated the same way, but they have a salary differential cap that they've all agreed to, which is, I believe, I might be getting this wrong, I believe it's 2.8x. So I think the lowest paid worker is paid 1/3 what the highest paid worker is, compared to 350x, which is not uncommon in the United States. So the short answer though is, and that's why democracy matters, it's just like whatever they want to do, there's no blueprint. It's like whatever works for them is what they should do.
Thanks for the really thoughtful talk. I'm curious what you think the appropriate role of government is in the whole picture. Public funding, public regulation, how does that fit in?
Yeah, no, that's also a very good question. So there's a sort of a paradox, I think, in liberal democracies in the West, where there's this belief that democracy and capitalism can coexist, which, that's like obvious, right? That's the line that I was fed my whole life. But I actually think they're deeply incompatible, right? You have a system where people are ostensibly politically, equal, even that's not true, but ostensibly. And you have a system that doesn't even attempt to make people economically equal. So what we see is, people turning economic power into political power trivially, and especially in America. So I think as far as the government is concerned, in the face of capitalism, it just gets swallowed up by it. That's why people who will say like, well, capitalism's fine, we just need to regulate it. And that's never worked historically, because capital just, eats government and then, writes its own regulations. As far as bigger governments are concerned, so that aside, I'm not totally convinced about a one-size-fits-all large, centralized government. I do tend towards anarchism. I'm much more amenable to local communities that sort of govern themselves. There is a balancing act, though, and the place to look to for that is Rojava in northeast Syria, which I had a slide in here of Rojava that I took out, but maybe I should have kept. Rojava is they don't self-identify as anarchists, so I won't call them anarchists, but they are a democratic municipalist or region in northeast Syria with local governance. So it's very decentralized, but there are certain values that they held dear in the revolution, one of which was the emancipation of women. And they knew that if they just let villages in the Middle East sort of decide their own thing, that women would never be emancipated. So as part of the uprising, they made sure that women had veto power on all like local democratic decisions. They also gave a lot of women guns, like a lot of their militias are just women. And then they said like, okay, now you can go and self-govern, right? Because we've put the tools in place to like actually like protect your local democracies. And they do have some semblance of a central government, but it's extremely weak and atrophied. So there's a bit of a balancing act, but yeah, those are kind of my thoughts.
Over here.
Hey, Ramsey. Lovely, amazing walk, tying up a lot of themes together. One of the things that keep sticking out to me is the role of programmer in opposition to the application enjoyer, and what the responsibility is of that application enjoyer in funding and feedback and governance and the care and feeding of the human who keeps the code alive.
Yeah, that's fair. So I think there's a couple of ways to come at that. One is, I guess the anarchist answer is, like any border between application enjoyer and programmer, is that a border we can erase and make porous? And there have been programming, like Lisp machines historically did this, not known for their anarchist ideals, but like did this historically. The other sort of way to answer it, though, that aside, is I think, again, to think about things holistically, like there are more than just those two actors, right? Like, why have we built a society where a programmer is not able to be fed and housed, right? And I feel when I talk about stability and when I talk about the rest of the circle, that's the kind of thing that enables that, right? If I, this is me being censored by the state, if the programmer is fed and housed and not stressed out, the issue becomes moot. So that's why I think as a first principle, that is meeting people's basic needs begins to have ripple effects on these other questions.
Over here. Thank you, Ramsey. Okay, for what it's worth, Flash 5, the Macromedia, will run on wine. I've tried it. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll install it like as soon as I get off the podium.
All right. And second thing is, my mind started wandering to space travel. So our finitude of resources may not be, so it may tend towards speed of light. I don't know. And another thing, I started thinking about mechanical computers. And and whether life that as we have is somewhat of a computer, or it's a substrate for computing. Do you have any thoughts about any of those?
So space travel, I'm not optimistic in that. I mean, I think it's exciting. I think we are of this planet, and we are part of it. And I think if we try and live on other planets, it's I don't think that that's our salvation. I don't. And then there's like asteroid mining and stuff like that. But like, it's, I mean, the short answer is I'm not optimistic, and I can sort of get into it. Do I think life is a computer? I mean, that gets very philosophical, I guess. I'm very nervous around interpretations of like human mind or the human soul or whatever that attempt to reduce it to a machine. I feel like, computer science is a model, like computing is a model with limitations. Like, it's got the halting problem. It's not even, arbitrarily powerful. And I think trying to reduce something like the human mind into a model that was created by the human mind is almost like self-referential in a way that doesn't work. So I feel like we don't understand ourselves well enough to like fit ourselves into a model that we created. Maybe is the sort of the complete answer.
All right, last question over here. I really love that. Sorry, one sec. I'm struggling to put this question fully into words, but I really liked what you were saying about prefigurative computing. And there's a problem I've been kind of grappling with myself that I guess I was curious if you had thoughts on. You're on Mastodon, and Mastodon has this culture of trying to push back against certain features that they think go against the culture or like the sort of social network that they want to encourage, things like search and so on. And that debate always reminds me of David Graeber's The Art of Not Being Governed, which for other people here who may not have read it, follows some tribes in, I believe it's the Vietnamese Highlands, and shows up different ways in which they've rejected advances like currency as a way of pushing back against oppression by the surrounding states. Yeah. And I guess I was curious about whether you thought that sort of behavior that we see specifically in cases like Mastodon is a useful way of engaging in prefigurative computing, or if it's like, I guess, kind of folly because bad actors can do what they want anyway in that sort of environment?
No, that's a great question. I don't think it's folly at all, and I think it is absolutely the kind of prefigurative action that I'm talking about. Another problem that I didn't get into with the profit motive is how much profit should you make, right? The correct answer is infinity, right? Which is a useless answer. Like, you can't do math. Like, I can't reason about that. I can't predict like how many months until we get to infinity. Well, infinity, right? And the sense of like more is better, I think, leaches into just every aspect of like the way people perceive the world. So the idea of like more features are just better, I think, is false, right? That's just not the case. And so being very selective, not just about what you build, but it's like, it's like jazz is about the notes you don't play, right? It's like, maybe a social network is about the features you don't implement. In terms of like, well, bad actors will just do it anyway. I mean, that's a kind of surrender that I think is like unacceptable, honestly. Like, I mean, yes, Nazis are out there and, bad actors are out there, but, it's our responsibility to push back against that, right? Because if not us, then no one.
Thank you, Ramsey. Fantastic.
Thank you.